Relativity ignited their engines, but it wasn't enough. Is SpaceX moving out of landing zone 1 and 2? Traffic's been busy with secret Russian and Chinese launches, and much more is to come in this edition of Tomorrow Space News. Well, this wasn't really expected. Super Heavy Booster 7 has been removed from the orbital launch mount following its 31 engine static fire only a few weeks ago. Now, it hasn't been rolled down the highway, so could this move just be to give teams better access to the OLM for upgrades, or could B7 just be waiting for some space to be cleared up at the production site? Peering into the production site at night, Ship 28's nose cone has been stacked onto its payload bay section. The more ships that SpaceX build, the higher capacity they'll have for testing them, but they also run the risk of building ships which become obsolete. Nose cone 31, a test nose cone, has become the latest resident of the Massey's test site. This could mean that SpaceX still want testing data out of the prototype, whilst also not clogging up the launch site in the build-up to the highly anticipated orbital flight test. The new ship lifting rig has been getting tested, with a solid bar standing in for the world's first fully reusable launch vehicle. The idea is that instead of lifting points at the top of the ships, standard cranes can act like the chopsticks hooking onto the side pins. Crane fans rejoice as this new Liebherr LR1750 has been spotted at the Rocket Garden. It's just a crane, but ever since they've been getting nicknames, people have been getting hooked. A few hours up the road in McGregor, this new Falcon 9 booster has been cryo-proofed in preparation for a static fire of all 9 Merlins under the stage. 4 launch providers have been allocated launch pads at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station by Space Launch Delta 45, the division of the US Space Force which oversees Patrick Space Force Base and the CCSFS. ABL Space Systems have been allocated Space Launch Complex 15, the most southern of the original Titan pads on Missile Row. This complex has not been used since 1964, when the last Titan II departed on its suborbital trajectory. Stoke Space have a launch pad on the Cape, and they've been allocated Slick 14. This pad is most famous for hosting Mercury Atlas 6, the mission which launched John Glenn into orbit, becoming the first American to do so. The 45th have confirmed that they will be working alongside Stoke Space to ensure the history of the site is preserved, especially considering its historical significance for the United States. This complex was last used in 1966 when it hosted the launch of the Agena target vehicle used on Gemini 12. And the final 2 companies are going to be sharing a launch complex, as Phantom Space and Viaspace have both been allocated to Slick 13, the current residence of which is SpaceX. You'd better know them as Landing Zone 1 and Landing Zone 2. This creates an interesting situation for Falcon 9s performing a return to launch site recovery, like we'll see later in Space Traffic, and for Falcon Heavies, which require a dual booster landing. I assume that each of the landing pads will go to each company respectively, and from there they'll be converted into launch pads to support their respective launch vehicles. The 45th have said that Phantom Space and Viaspace, quote, will be the only users of Slick 13 once the real property agreement is executed. Notice how that didn't mention SpaceX at all? They're moving out of what has become a historical site, I'd argue, the location of the first successful RTLS of an orbital class booster. So, where are they going to land the Falcons, and are SpaceX going to end RTLS recoveries at the Cape? To answer the latter of those, no, they're not. To answer the former, I haven't got a clue. Future Starship pads have been proposed north of Complex 39, so could new Falcon landing pads be constructed there ASAP? There is certainly much more unused land on the Kennedy side than on the Space Force side. An article from Florida Today states that the KSC is interested in hosting a landing zone, but that article is over 5 years old, so that can be taken with a pinch of salt, but it does sound reasonable. The truth of the matter is, nobody outside of SpaceX really knows at the moment, but with the observation satellite capabilities that we have in this modern age, it should be pretty clear as soon as a giant concrete slab is being laid down. Relativity have been trying to launch their inaugural flight, and for a first attempt at a new company and a new rocket, it hasn't been going that bad. Their first attempt on the 8th of March eventually ended with the propellant in Stage 2 exceeding the thermal limits that the vehicle could accept for launch. The liquid methane needs to be in the right condition for use in the Aeon vac engine, and you don't want your temperatures messing with your prop density. The clock managed to get down to just under T-23 minutes. The second attempt was set for March 11th and the company got incredibly close to launch, but spoiler alert, it unfortunately still wasn't to be. The first attempt to fly during the launch window saw the 9 engines ignite, but then abort at T-minus half a second because the stage separation automation wasn't 100% committed. There was plenty of time left within the launch window, however, so could they recycle just in time? Well, the launch team thought that they could, so the clock started ticking for an instantaneous launch of 2100 Universal Time, the very end of Relativity's approved launch window for that day. Unfortunately, however, this second attempt within the second attempt was halted at T-minus 45 seconds as the pressure of the fuel inside the second stage was 1 psi below the required level for launch. That second stage seemed to keep getting cold feet. Firstly, the propellant was too hot, then it wasn't pressurized high enough. Fingers crossed, every part of the vehicle will be working as expected on Thursday as the next launch window that Relativity can attempt within opens at 1700 UTC. United Launch Alliance are pressing on with their pre-launch preparations for Vulcan, their next generation launch vehicle. CEO Tori Bruno shared a Tori time-lapse of the core stage and the Centaur 5 upper stage rolling out of the vertical integration facility to Space Launch Complex 41 on Thursday. Once it was hooked up to the ground service equipment at the pad, the testing began. First up, the core stage. Both the liquid oxygen and liquid methane tanks were included in the first tanking demonstration, which saw the epic red flame obscured with ice. According to ULA, this tanking demo went as planned. Unfortunately though, the plan of rolling the vehicle back to the VIF once testing was fully completed has been ditched due to poor weather. Vulcan will now be heading for shelter whilst the less than desirable weather passes over the Cape. I'm going to assume that when the weather is nice again, ULA will roll Vulcan straight back out to the pad and continue where they left off. Japan finally managed to launch their brand new cost-cutting H3 rocket on Tuesday, but before we get into that, quickly, thank you to the citizens of tomorrow for financially supporting the show. Station 204 isn't cheap to operate and your kind contributions help to offset the costs every month. If you want to see your name in every news and live show, and you want access to our member exclusive hangouts, and you want to see Space News scripts as they're being written, then consider heading to the join button below. If you just want to share the channel with whomever you think would enjoy our content, that is also a really helpful and free way to grow the community. Let's head back to Japan. The inaugural flight of the H3 rocket in its 2-2 configuration launched at 01:37 Coordinated Universal Time on the 7th of March from Launch Area Y2 at the Tanegashima Space Center. After performing one heck of a dogleg maneuver that changed the trajectory of the vehicle by nearly 90 degrees, the first stage had completed its job and it was over to the second stage to deliver the 3 metric ton ALOS-3 observation satellite to its sun synchronous orbit. Unfortunately, the second stage failed to light its single Hydrolox powered LE-5B3 engine and Mission Control decided it would be best to terminate the flight, which they did by destroying the second stage. It was a sad end to a very exciting start, so fingers crossed JAXA and MHI will be able to analyse the data and get back to flying the H3 very soon. Thursday saw OneWeb Launch 17 depart from Slick 40 at the Cape aboard this Falcon 9 at 1913 UTC. Flying the southern polar corridor, threading the needle between Florida and the Bahamas, all 40 satellites were successfully delivered into their desired initial orbit. Eventually, similar to Starlink, they'll be raising themselves up to a 1200 km orbit around the Earth. The booster supporting OneWeb's final dedicated contracted flight with SpaceX B-1062 successfully flipped around and returned to Cape Canaveral, touching down on landing zone 1. Also on Thursday was the launch of this Long March 4C, carrying the Tianhui 6A and Tianhui 6B satellites to a sun-synchronous orbit. Not a lot of details have been released about these satellites other than their full cartography. This flight originated from Launch Complex 9 at the Taiwan Satellite Launch Center at 2241 Universal. This is Space Traffic, so not only do we cover the departures, but we also cover the arrivals. SpaceX's Crew 5 mission undocked from the forward port on the Harmony module on the International Space Station at 0720 UTC on Saturday. Following the deorbit burn, Dragon Endurance was streaking across the sky above the Gulf of Mexico as the capsule was decelerating from an orbital velocity to a velocity which the drogue chutes could handle. Eventually, 4 healthy mains were unfurled, giving the crew of Nicole Mann, Josh Casada, Koichi Wakata and Anya Kikina a relatively smooth splashdown into the Gulf. Following checks to ensure that no toxic chemicals were lingering around the vehicle, Endurance was lifted onto support ship Shannon's Dragon Nest. From here, the crew were unloaded and given a chance to breathe earthly air for the first time since October. Sunday night, Universal, early in the morning local time, saw the launch of Olymp K2 on a Proton M rocket from Site 8124 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The satellite was delivered to a geostationary transfer orbit, where it'll be raising itself to a geostationary orbit. The purpose of this mission is not known to the public, however it is being operated by the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russia Intelligence Agency. Unfortunately, due to the military nature of this mission, all we have at the moment are these photos. And finally, we had another launch from China, being Horus 2 from Site 9401 at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. Carrying the Horus 2 payload, this mission was launched on this Long March 2C at 0402 Universal Time on Monday to a sun-synchronous orbit. Rocket Lab has a dual hemisphere doubleheader coming up, if you can count a doubleheader as spreading over 3 days that is, with Stronger Together scheduled for launch from Wallops on Tuesday and The Beat Goes On scheduled to launch from Mahia on Thursday. SpaceX, of course, are throwing their own flight into the mix with the resupply mission CRS-27 scheduled for launch on Wednesday. China has a Long March 11 launch also scheduled for Wednesday. As I mentioned earlier, Relativity are going at it again on Thursday from 1700 UTC. There could be a Starlink launch from Vandenberg on Thursday also, and SpaceX have yet another flight up their sleeve with SES-18 and 19 scheduled for launch from the Cape on Saturday. Whew. You know it's going to be a very busy week when the launches are averaging out to 1 per day, and there's only 4 organisations involved. What isn't as busy are the shows coming your way this week on tomorrow. Make sure to catch Dr. Tamitha Scove's latest weather update on Wednesday. Fingers crossed Jared's Jeep will be able to make it to Station 204 on Friday, and as always I'll be back next Monday with much more news. Thanks for watching everyone, and goodbye.